The 1970s gave us some of the boldest films ever put on screen, but not everyone was ready for them. Censors slashed reels, theaters pulled posters, and in some towns you couldn't even buy a ticket. But here's the twist. Decades later, those same forbidden movies are finally free to watch in full. Which of these lost troublemakers still pack a punch uncut? Let's dive into the reels that once shook the system. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. Few films caused as much public panic as Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. At first glance, it's a stylish dystopian drama about a gang of young rebels in futuristic Britain, but the raw energy of Malcolm McDowell's performance sent audiences spiraling. When it opened in America, protests followed quickly. Critics were divided between calling it a masterpiece and labeling it pure corruption. Cities across the U.S. even debated banning it, terrified of copycat behavior. Kubrick's vision wasn't about shock for its own sake. He used extreme imagery as a mirror, asking what happens when freedom collides with control. Yet that nuance was lost on many censors. Scenes were trimmed for American release, and rumors swirled that the movie was influencing real-life crimes. By the mid-70s, the controversy grew so heated that the film became a whispered name in film clubs rather than something you could casually rent. What makes the restored cut so striking today is how modern it feels. The bright, futuristic sets, the blasting Beethoven soundtrack, and Kubrick's obsessive attention to detail feel like they belong in any decade. Watching it uncut, you realize just how daring it was to put violence, politics, and style in the same blender and serve it as art. The movie's edge hasn't dulled. If anything, it still asks harder questions than many films made half a century later. Straw Dogs, 1971. Sam Peckinpah was no stranger to controversy. With The Wild Bunch, he redefined screen violence, but Straw Dogs was something else entirely. Starring Dustin Hoffman as a mild academic pushed to extremes in rural England, the movie plays like a slow burn that erupts into sheer chaos. When American distributors saw it, panic set in. Certain sequences were considered far too intense for audiences, and the scissors came out quickly. What's fascinating is how Peckinpah balanced grit with intellect. This wasn't just shock value. The story peeled back layers of civilization, asking whether a civilized man could ever truly bury his instinct for survival. But critics and censors didn't care about philosophy. They saw a film that looked like a raw nerve, too ugly for the suburbs, too savage for polite society. Scenes were hacked down, whole minutes disappeared, and for years audiences only got fragments of Peckinpah's vision. The uncut version reveals how deliberate the film really is. It builds with unsettling quietness, Hoffman shrinking into himself while the tension of the town closes around him like a fist. By the time it explodes into its infamous finale, you're not sure whether you're horrified or oddly relieved. That's the mark of true storytelling power. It makes you question your own reactions. Today, with the full cut restored, Straw Dog stands less as a banned oddity and more as a daring psychological powder keg that's still as difficult and important as when it first played. The Exorcist, 1973. When William Friedkin's The Exorcist arrived, it was more than just a horror movie. It was a nationwide event. Lines stretched around blocks, theaters set up barf bags, and fainting spells were reported coast to coast. Censors quickly jumped in, trimming footage they claimed was too disturbing. But what they couldn't cut was the atmosphere, a sense of unease that infected anyone who dared watch. The trimmed reels sat in vaults for decades, whispered about by fans who swore they'd seen more shocking moments during the film's earliest screenings. Then in 2000, the uncut version was re-released with the tagline, "The version you've never seen." Suddenly, audiences were treated to the infamous spider walk down the stairs and extended sequences that gave the story more weight. It wasn't just about shock anymore, it was about Friedkin's relentless precision in creating tension. The real power of the restored film is how layered it feels. Beneath the scares, it's a story about helplessness in the face of the unexplainable. And Friedkin's filmmaking is ruthless in how it refuses to let you look away. Watching the full cut today, it's clear why censors once panicked. But it's also clear why it survived, because it wasn't just horror, it was cinema at its most fearless. And fearless cinema never stays buried for long. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Here's the irony. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is remembered as one of the most violent movies ever made, but most of the gore you think you saw isn't even on screen. What made people faint in theaters wasn't buckets of blood, it was sheer suggestion, the grainy realism of Tobe Hooper's vision. Yet censors weren't convinced. The movie was slapped with bans across multiple American states, with headlines branding it filth and garbage cinema. Hooper's film, shot on a shoestring budget with actors enduring real sweat, heat, and the stench of rotting props, feels like a fever dream. Its rawness tricked people into believing they'd seen something far worse than what actually played. The MPAA hacked at it, foreign distributors shredded it even further, and for years the complete version was a myth. Yet fans traded bootleg tapes, each promising to be uncut, keeping the legend alive. When restoration finally came, audiences were stunned. The uncut film wasn't a gore fest, it was a masterclass in dread. Hooper created a world where every creak of a floorboard and every buzz of the chainsaw felt personal. It didn't need gallons of fake blood to terrify. It needed atmosphere. Watching it today uncut, you see the genius clearly. A low-budget nightmare that terrified a generation into thinking they'd seen more than they had. That's the power of suggestion, and that's why it still works uncut. Pink Flamingos, 1972. John Waters didn't just push boundaries, he bulldozed them. Pink Flamingos became the definition of a midnight movie, whispered about as the most outrageous film ever made. Shot in Baltimore with Waters' underground cast of misfits, it wasn't designed for mainstream theaters. And yet, when word spread, censors pounced. Screenings were raided, reels were confiscated, and in many places the film was outright banned. What kept it alive was the underground circuit. Fans traded stories about the movie too wild to watch, and art houses packed out midnight slots just to dare the audience. The controversy made it bigger than it ever could have been without the bans. Waters himself leaned into the reputation, proudly calling it an exercise in bad taste. Censors tried to bury it, but all they did was give it eternal cult status. Seeing the full uncut version today, it's obvious why it rattled polite society. It wasn't polished, it wasn't polite, and it wasn't meant to be. It was rebellion on celluloid, a middle finger to the idea that movies had to play by rules. Decades later, its shock value might feel less dangerous, but its energy is still radioactive. Waters proved that cinema could be messy, offensive, and alive. Watching it uncut now isn't just about seeing what censors hid, it's about feeling the raw nerve of independent film at its most fearless. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Wes Craven's debut wasn't just a movie, it was a dare, marketed with the infamous tagline, "It's only a movie." The Last House on the Left tore into theaters like a brick through a window. What audiences got was far more brutal than the usual drive-in shockers. The story, loosely inspired by Bergman's The Virgin Spring, followed two girls who fall into the hands of criminals, only to have the tables turned in ways that shocked even hardened viewers. What rattled the system was how raw it all felt. Craven and producer Sean S. Cunningham shot with an almost documentary style, blurring the line between fiction and reality. The censors weren't fooled. Entire reels were slashed for American release. Some theaters projected bowdlerized versions that felt like patchwork, while others flat out refused to screen it. For years, depending on where you lived, you might see 10 different cuts of the same film, each missing different chunks. The uncut restoration shows just how ambitious Craven was. He didn't set out to make just a grindhouse flick. He wanted to explore the thin line between civilized justice and primal revenge. That ambition is why the film survived. Yes, it's rough, yes, it's messy, but it's also a chill landmark in American horror. Watching it uncut today isn't comfortable, and that's the point. Craven forced the audience to face violence without the filter of studio polish. The result? A controversial debut that became the first stone in a career that reshaped horror. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. If there's one title that haunted video stores in whispered tones, it's I Spit on Your Grave. Originally released under the name Day of the Woman, this was no glossy Hollywood thriller. It was an independent grindhouse feature shot in upstate New York, and when it landed, it hit with the force of a cultural earthquake. Critics labeled it vile, censors came down like hammers, and in many states it was either chopped to ribbons or yanked entirely. What made it so infamous was its sheer relentlessness. There was no studio filter, no stylized editing to soften the blows. It looked and felt too real, and that's what terrified censors. They didn't see a film, they saw danger. For years, audiences only got watered-down versions, sometimes missing 20 minutes or more. Ironically, those edits only made the movie feel disjointed, while the original structure revealed the full arc the filmmakers intended. The uncut version, now widely available, makes it clear why it mattered. Beneath the grime lies a story of survival, of a woman refusing to be broken. It's ugly, yes, but it's also strangely empowering in its fury. Modern critics have reevaluated it as more than exploitation, as a bold if messy statement about resilience. Watching it today in full isn't about enjoying shock for shock's sake. It's about finally seeing the film as its creators meant it, a raw scream of independence that censors tried and failed to silence. The Hills Have Eyes, 1977. Wes Craven didn't just stop at one controversy. 5 years after Last House, he unleashed The Hills Have Eyes, and once again the scissors came out. This desert-set nightmare told of an ordinary family stranded in the wastelands, hunted by a feral clan. It was part survival thriller, part allegory about civilization versus savagery, and all nightmare fuel. What tripped up censors this time was the violence. The MPAA cut entire moments to keep the film from being slapped with the dreaded X rating. International releases hacked it up even worse. Some versions stripped away so much that the movie barely made sense. But the uncut version shows what Craven was really doing. He wasn't glorifying horror, he was studying it. The film deliberately forces you to compare the civilized family with their attackers, showing how desperation can twist anyone into something unrecognizable. What's remarkable today is how fresh it still feels. The grainy cinematography, the barren desert landscapes, the eerie quiet that bursts into violence, it all still works. And seeing it uncut restores the balance of the story, letting you witness both the terror and the transformation. Craven was building a legacy of horror that was smarter than it looked, and The Hills Have Eyes in its full form proves it. Censors wanted to neuter it, but what they couldn't kill was its central idea. In the wilderness, we're all just prey. The Town That Dreaded Sundown, 1976. Before Halloween, before Friday the 13th, there was The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Loosely based on real events in Texarkana during the 1940s, the movie followed a hooded killer stalking couples at night. Its gritty docudrama style made it unnerving in a way that slick slasher flicks never could. But when it debuted, censors and local officials weren't pleased. Certain sequences were trimmed for regional releases, and TV showings hacked it into near incoherence. What's fascinating about this film is how it blends horror with a pseudo-police procedural. It doesn't just focus on the killings, it spends time with investigators, townsfolk, and the paranoia that sweeps through a community under siege. That mix gave it a unique flavor, but also made it unpredictable, which unsettled distributors who wanted something more conventional. The uncut version brings back the eerie rhythm. Shots linger just long enough to make you squirm, and the killer's silence is more terrifying than any special effect. Watching it uncut today, you see the DNA of modern slashers. It's not flashy, but it's hauntingly effective. And in an odd twist, Texarkana still screens the film every Halloween at a drive-in. The same town once terrified by its release now embraces it as part of its legend. That's what happens when a censored film survives. It goes from feared to celebrated. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. If ever there was a title designed to draw censors like moths to flame, it was Blood-Sucking Freaks. Released under several different names, including the incredible torture show, this independent shocker became a lightning rod for outrage. In the 1970s, authorities were already cracking down on exploitation cinema, and this one became their favorite target. It was banned in multiple states, seized in raids, and condemned in headlines. But here's the twist. For all its sleaze and excess, the movie became a cult classic. It played midnight circuits, passed from hand to hand on grainy VHS tapes, and developed a reputation as one of the most unwatchable films ever made. For many, that was the exact reason to watch it. What the censors didn't understand was that banning it only made it legendary. The uncut version is still abrasive, still a test of endurance, but it's also a time capsule of 1970s underground cinema. It shows what filmmakers could get away with when studios weren't looking, and why authorities panicked. It's not for everyone, but that's exactly the point. Watching it uncut today isn't about enjoying the spectacle. It's about understanding the line that exploitation filmmakers were willing to cross, and how those lines shaped the grindhouse culture that would influence film for decades. The fact that it survived, despite being a top target for censorship, is proof that no film is ever truly buried. Faces of Death, 1978. By the late 70s, horror had seen just about everything, or so audiences thought. Then came Faces of Death. Part documentary, part horror collage, it claimed to show real-life accidents, rituals, and tragedies stitched together into one feature. Whether every moment was genuine or staged didn't matter. What mattered was that it looked real, and that was enough to send censors into full-blown panic. Bans were slapped down across states. TV news ran segments about how dangerous the movie was, warning kids to stay away, which naturally guaranteed they would try to see it. Video stores in the 80s were flooded with copies, many labeled as banned in 46 countries, whether that was true or not. It became the forbidden fruit of VHS, the tape everyone dared each other to watch. The uncut version pulls no punches. Some of it is clearly staged, some of it may not be, but all of it hits with the same gut punch. An exploration of how much audiences can stomach when a movie looks too much like reality. Today, it's easy to see why it was a target for censors. It blurred lines too well, but it also opened the door for found footage horror and documentary-style scares. Watching it uncut now is less about shock and more about realizing how ahead of its time it really was. Mondo Cane, 1970. Before shock documentaries became a trend, there were the Mondo films. These Italian imports were spliced together from global footage and marketed in the U.S. as if they were forbidden glimpses into the wildest corners of the world. Mondo Cane, 2 hit American theaters in 1970, and it wasn't long before censors noticed. Scenes of rituals, cruelty, and bizarre customs were labeled too extreme for local audiences, and American distributors scrambled to cut them down. The result was a film that existed in multiple versions, each depending on how squeamish your local censor board felt. In some towns, screenings played intact. In others, reels were shredded into incoherence. That unpredictability gave it an aura of danger, and people flocked to see what was being hidden. Today, the uncut version survives as both an oddity and an influence. You can trace a direct line from the Mondo films to the later shockumentaries of the 70s and 80s, including Faces of Death. What stands out now isn't just the footage itself, but the way it was marketed as something you weren't supposed to see. And as history has proven, telling audiences they can't watch something is the surest way to guarantee they'll track it down. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth was never a straightforward sci-fi film. With David Bowie in his first major starring role, it told the story of an alien stranded on Earth, corrupted by greed and indulgence. The film was strange, sprawling, and filled with imagery that baffled audiences. And when American distributors got their hands on it, they panicked. Sequences were cut, trimming down Bowie's otherworldly transformation into something more palatable. For years, Americans only saw a muted version. But cinephiles knew something was missing. Overseas, longer versions circulated, feeding the legend that a real cut existed somewhere. Eventually, restorations brought back Roug's full vision, and the result was dazzling. The uncut version is pure Roug, non-linear, dreamlike, and hypnotic. Bowie drifts through the story like he belongs on another planet, equal parts magnetic and tragic. Watching it in its full form is like entering a hallucination, one that American censors tried to clean up, but only made stranger by cutting it. Seeing it uncut today restores not just footage, but meaning. It's proof that sometimes a film has to be confusing, messy, even overwhelming, because that's exactly what makes it unforgettable. So there you have it, 15 films the censors tried to chop down, bury, or erase, but couldn't keep hidden forever. Watching them uncut today isn't just about shock value. It's about seeing the 1970s exactly as it was, fearless, messy, and impossible to tame. Which one of these do you think deserves the crown as the boldest? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe, and let's keep digging up the reels they never wanted us to see.